some of the things that Ed Schumann was talking about. And I really prefer to sit around here for an hour and talk about Jim Tootle and Big Bad Anderson and Birdhouse Smith and stories like that. But I'm afraid, with all that, so many memories come from that last session that I get a little bit emotional. And of course, as we know, there is no crying in vintage baseball, so we can't do that. I do have sort of a program I can talk about, but what I'm really anticipating is that you'll have questions, because I think there's only 3 of us in the room from Illinois, and so your interest in the evolution of baseball in Illinois is probably not the same level as mine, and you're going to spend 10 years figuring it out. But there are things that you can take back to your teams, especially through the book, that could be a map for somebody who wanted to do it. And there's only been 2. There's Peter Morris's Baseball Fever in Early Michigan, and then this book. There are other books that are sort of at a smaller level, but they tend to concentrate on 2 or 3 teams, and I'll talk about why that is not really helpful beyond those 2 or 3 teams.
Can you tell me where it's stored on here? Because it wouldn't let me, I'm going to have to manually move it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, it's in, it would be, let me see.
So just drag it onto onto this window, which is
Do you need any white cables?
possible.
How do I do it?
I just leave
Oh,
this.
you don't have an HDMI?
Kelly, I need a memory card. But I've done that with the television.
Okay.
How do I drag it? I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
There it is.
These are
Send
my
it
random
to
cables.
Sorry guys, I thought I had every room figured out and there'd be no glitches when you walked into the room.
I can show you.
Yeah. Show me the folder.
Well, I followed it.
So did he get past the introduction of his book? No, he didn't even get that far. You know what I should have done for the backup is I have my recording from the 2016 conference. We could be running that while we're waiting for this to get hooked up. Imagine he came to our 2016 conference, he had a map of Illinois, and he had little pins where every one of the clubs were that played in Illinois. Wow. Which, just, can you imagine with the microfiche machine and the data, and then somewhere in that time, and Christine will get me on this, he ended up having to move from his homestead. What was it, in Mattoon that he moved from?
Decatur.
Decatur. He moved from Decatur, and if any of you are into saving and hoarding stuff like I am, and Bob is, you can imagine what that was like. So he had to take all those files, or all of the research he'd been doing for the last 10 years, and move them to Bloomington. And he was still able to
You
publish the
should
book.
see our garage.
Yes, there it is, there it is. We can tell stories about him because he's not talking right
That's
now. It's
right.
the perfect time for him. And those that don't know Bob, he was an associate professor at Millikan, U of I, got his doctorate there in history. He's not a lightweight when it comes to his background, but he's user-friendly, and that's the most important thing about Bob.
Be careful. That's
I'm sorry. I'm in trouble again.
Yeah, well, you're like me, you're always in trouble with some degree. So just to give you a little bit of background, I'm going to hit some of the highlights here, things that you might be interested in, or what we found in Illinois that maybe is important. Over 1,000 teams, and that would be including adult teams, junior teams, and what they call pony teams. Pony teams would be 14, 15. Now these are organized teams. Most baseball in Illinois, and I suspect in Ohio, and Pennsylvania, and Michigan, was unorganized. And you hear about unorganized baseball when they break a window, or in the case of Bloomington, they kick the whole team out of the town. Say no more baseball playing in the city limits. So that was just the teams, and I had some help on that with Proto Baseball. They have a website that helped me fill in some blanks. What was very helpful to me was I was able to identify 223 players. Now, there was probably 10,000 players, 1,000 teams, at least 10,000 players. And so that's a real challenge. Those of you that have done historical research know that the 19th century had absolutely no consideration for the future. So they'll have a roster of the team: Smith, Jones, Williams. All right, who was, once in a while they might have a first name initial. And you're really fortunate if there's like two brothers on the same team, and so they have to differentiate. And then you can start looking for them. So you get a list of all these names that you think might be identifiable. Peter Morris is very good at this, much better than I am. And then you start going through city directories. You go through census records, anything you can find to get those names, and we're able to get 223, able to classify all but 38 by occupation. So we know who was playing baseball, and it's not always who you would think. The image of these clerks, and it was all about clerks and lawyers and people that had money. Yeah, they were a lot of them, but there were a lot of people. There were farmers, there were teamsters, there were people that seemed to have no sustainable occupation. They were there. 15 that were elected or appointed officials. People who had, only a couple were elected. A lot of them were probably sons who were assistant clerks in this office or an assistant postmaster or whatever. But that was, they would have the ability to get away and practice. This sounds terrible. It'll probably keep a lot of you from even thinking about buying the book, but at the end of the book there's 49 pages of notes and bibliography. Why is that important? Jim Tootle can tell you. The first place a historian looks when they get a new book is they go to the back. Where's all this coming from, and where can I go to find this stuff if I want more stuff about that? So that would be a great help if, say, you go back to Michigan or Florida or somewhere and say, hey, we ought to try and do this. We ought to try and figure out what was going on here. So I start it opens with a great picture. I don't see Bill Dykeman here, but he'd love it because it's a picture of the 1869 Cincinnati Red Stockings. Why are they important? They weren't from Illinois. They're the watershed. If you want to point to a moment and say, when did the gentleman's amateur game, and I'll talk about why it was such in a minute, why did that end, and why did it become a game that adults no longer played as organized clubs, and it sort of went to the juniors in an organized club? Why? Because in October of 1869, on their way back from San Francisco, they stopped in Quincy. Those of you who don't know Illinois, Quincy is sort of like that little western protrusion on the Mississippi River. They came across Mississippi River, played. The Quincy team had to charge admission, so they moved the game to the fairgrounds. Why go to the fairgrounds? Because you have gates. You can charge admission. So they had to move there. They had to pay these people, and it's in the book how much. I'm not going to try and test my memory. So it was Cincinnati's not going to stop there out of the goodness of their heart. They got bills to pay. They got Rockford, which was a semi-professional team in Illinois by that point. They had been there earlier. They had to pay Rockford. Albert Goodwell Spalding, who some of you heard me say, Hall of Famer, who the more you read about and learn about, the more you hate him. And now, I'm sure Albert Spalding would sort of say, oh, let's count that last dime. So this is the Quincy Club, the adult club, the Occidentals, had been, fairly successful. We can talk in a minute why, if you have questions, why can't we say who was the best team in Illinois? We can't. They ended up losing this game 51-7. The Cincinnati club was hitting the ball so hard they hit some poor old lady who was watching from the carriage and all but knocked her out. Some little guy laying on the sideline got hit in the stomach. All this is in the game stories. They go nuts about stuff like this. And that was the last game the Quincy Occidentals ever played. And so certainly by 1869, those adult clubs disappeared. Too bad I can't show you a great picture of Alexis de Tocqueville. How many know who Alexis de Tocqueville? Ever heard of Alexis de Tocqueville? Okay, no reason you should have. But he was this French guy that toured the United States in 1829, 1830, 31, and he went back to France, like anybody who came to the United States at that point from Europe, and went back and wrote a best-selling book. Except his book is the one that historians still go back to time and time again. They don't go back and read Dickens or some of the other guys that came over and said nasty things about us. We go back and read de Tocqueville, because de Tocqueville, I don't know how he did it. This is, a Frenchman who's never been in the United States, barely spoke English. He hung around with the worst kind of people. Not that they were fine people, but I mean to understand what was moving the country. It was the age of Jackson, right? Jackson he hangs around with Whigs, and so he gets this whole impression. But he's right. And one of the things he writes is, Americans of all ages, all stations in life, and all types of dispositions are forever forming associations. So you start with baseball by looking through that lens. Just like we would have a book club or a bird watching club. So they got together, they had meetings, they had committees to create constitutions and bylaws, they had fundraisers, they met regularly, they had dues. This was not, does anybody have a baseball club that does that today? Okay, you got bylaws and constitutions?
You got the whole thing.
Holy cow, well, the Tocqueville is happy. I'll send him a note, tell him to go to Flint, right?
No, Detroit, or early riser.
Early, okay, I thought you were, okay, Detroit, okay.
Flint's got a club.
Okay, closer, yeah. So, that's where we started. These clubs, I suspect, and we sort of see signs of it, have a lot of other uses. The Rotary? Why do people join the Rotary? Why do they join, or why did they used to join the Rotary or Kiwanis? Connections. You meet people, and we call it what? Networking. So that was a big deal. It rages through this is like, to certain audiences I say, remember the 1950s and the hula hoop. I know I'm going by people here, but there's some people, oh yeah, I remember. Everybody had to have a hula hoop. Well, and they didn't know anything about it, but they go out there and make fools of themselves, and they were selling selling for, I don't know how much a piece, and people were buying them up like crazy, put them in their garage, and they're probably still there in some places. But everybody had to have a hula hoop, or there's been other, remember the pet rock craze? We got to have a pet rock, or Cabbage Patch dolls, all that stuff, Beanie Babies, all those sort of things. But it was even bigger than that. I mean, it just was like this national, or Illinois, I can only speak of Illinois for sure, obsession. And the newspapers loved it. People would turn out by the hundreds, didn't know anything about the games, and would watch them and enjoy themselves. And so these game stories, again, the 19th century has the most inconsiderate people I've ever known. They don't care. They write these stuff up like, oh yeah, the club will play in its usual grounds. Well, all right, where's the usual grounds? Everybody in Peoria in 1867 knew where the usual grounds were. We don't. So the game stories tend to focus on all this extraneous stuff. And I'll read an example from one in a minute to show you how extraneous it was. So, and most of these clubs were outside Chicago, which gets to my point. Yeah, you could go online right now, and you could do a newspaper.com search, and you could get every newspaper story that still exists about baseball in Chicago between 1865 and 1870. And what would you have at the end of the day? The history of baseball in Chicago, which has already been covered by other people. So if you want to go into your areas, you are going to have to get some, maybe think about some appreciable seat time. You've got to get, as Gary mentioned, remember those old library things, those big machines, and you stuck your head in there and you're crying like that. Go through those newspapers, because there's much more baseball and there's much more enlightening about baseball, how it was played to the extent that we can know, which is not much, but how it was received and why it became popular and why it died out. Why did the popularity sort of go away? The game never went away, but the popularity went way down. You got to go to places like what's left of the Cairo newspapers, or Sterling, or other, countless little towns that maybe had a paper for 5 years, and thank goodness somebody in the 1930s photographed them all, put them on microfilm, and they're there waiting to be seen. And then you can sort of get an idea of what's going on state, from one end of the state to the other. The uniforms, I got a great, as Morris, Peter Morris, who I think is the best historian of early baseball, his great books, Baseball Fever in Early Michigan, the mandatory book, I think, for every vintage baseball team, 2 mandatory books for any vintage baseball team, James Tootle's Vintage Baseball, Peter Morris's But Didn't We Have Fun? You got those 2 things, you got all you need to know about, to get started. Morris says that was the primary identification, so they spent a lot of time and worry on these uniforms. In fact, I'm not going to read it to you because nobody likes to have something read. There's a whole paragraph here. Some editor, I think it was in Sterling, Northern Illinois, when there was rumor they were going to have a baseball team being formed there, he sat down and wrote this long advice. This is what the uniform should look like, even down to the colors and the cloth, the material cloth, flannel, canvas shoes. They had special baseball shoes. And I think they had, it's not clear, but I think they had those what we would call golf spikes on the bottom. Little pointy things. So at some point they outlawed those because people are getting stomped on with them to go to what we would recognize as a spike today. It was a big part of it was about ritual. And this is again something that, if you're all in vintage baseball, you would understand. It wasn't so much about the game. Certainly you wanted to win, and that becomes one of the problems, winning and losing. But whatever happens, you want to do it in a gentlemanly way, and you want to really spoil your visitors. So there's a whole series of expectations. They should be met if they come by train. Most of them come by train or boat, riverboat because of the rivers. When they arrive, they should be met at the depot or wherever by people from the team, their host team. They should often be taken to see the sights. The poor Red Stockings who just come from San Francisco and been riding on their tailbones on a train, with no Pullman cars all the way back. What happens? They get off. They come into Quincy and they get in carriages and they're given a tour of all the sights of Quincy. Well, I'm sure Quincy people thought they were nice, but if you're coming from San Francisco, there's not much in Quincy that's going to impress you. But I hope they were polite, Maybe that's why they won 51-7. They were getting their frustrations out. But this was on, and there's a passage in the book which I take one game, and it wasn't even a real game. It was a 3-game exhibition. And the team, for those who don't know Illinois geography, you got sort of Springfield in the center of the state, downstate, and then you've got off to the side a place called Jacksonville. So this team gets up early in the morning, takes the early train from Jacksonville to Springfield. They're actually on their way to Bloomington to play, which is farther east of Springfield, to play in a tournament. Play a little tournament there. This would have been 1866. And they're met at the depot by a delegation from the Springfield Capitals. It's another. I don't want to start doing when I was doing when I was teaching, and I digress. So I'm not going to digress. But ask me about the Springfield baseball team if you're interested. There's an interesting, very 20th century thing with that. So they're met there. They're fed breakfast. They're taken over to the Supreme Court chambers, the Illinois State Supreme Court chambers, in which local politicians, big names, people who have been governor or want to be governor, other state officials, come and speak to them, and welcome them to Springfield. Anybody here had the governor of Ohio or Michigan or whatever come and say, okay, the ground squirrels are in town. Let's tell them how great we are. No, so that would be enough. No, then they go and they have a big nice lunch, which they're not paying for this. A big nice lunch. Then they go out to the Railway Park, and play a 3-inning exhibition game and get back on the train and go to Bloomington for their main thing. So think about this, a 3-inning exhibition game, and you would have thought this was the Queen of England, coming into Springfield. This is the norm. And when teams don't do this, when they fail to show up at the depot, when they are not gracious to the visitors, you know about it, because their local newspapers will write, those no good so-and-sos from Lipsy Switch or wherever it was, they didn't even show up, or worse yet, at the end of the game, they walked off the field and did not even shake the hands or congratulate their thing. So these rituals are sort of what not only propel the game, but hold it together in those first couple of years. Because it's like, well, here's this new world, and it has all these aspirations we have. Polite conduct, competition, but friendly competition. We're all in this thing together. And we can go on about that if you have questions, but I'll jump ahead now real quick. Funding, how do they pay for all this? Well, we all deal with that, right? How do you pay for the Muffins or the Ground Squirrels or the Early Risers? Well, they had the same problems because they didn't have local history societies behind them or a living history society. They had to do it on their own. So a lot of it was local community. They would sometimes send out appeals when we need to get uniforms. Come down and contribute to that. Sometimes that had a counter reaction. Another editor would say, well, who do they think they are? Asking the public. We have a lot of other things we got to pay for. Let them buy their own uniforms. But they had dues. We know that certainly in Bloomington, there was a central location. And if you remember the Bloomington Baseball Club, which was one of the top 3 in the state, you should go to this G.W. Lackey's drug and tobacco store and stop by and pay your dues. It was easy to do. But the most popular thing was dances and balls. We have to recall a time when there's no internet, there's no radio, there's no TV, there's no motion pictures. People will turn out in droves to hear any halfway intelligent speaker go on for 2 hours and be happy with it. Sit there on their tail ends. So anything that's entertainment, any kind of a distraction, any kind of even a little bit of pageantry, they go for that. So this is a real gold mine for the teams. There's a great team in Centralia, the Centralia Egyptians. They were not immigrants. There's a southern part of Illinois, below Interstate 70, is called Egypt, and that's a whole other story. But anyways, they took the name Egyptians, and they were known as the kings of baseball and other balls being dancing. They were constantly having dances. Some teams had picnics. You'll see that the East St. Louis team, prior to the game, there'll be a picnic at the such and such grounds, and you can buy a picnic dinner, and the cost will go to defray that. Freeport, which is another interesting team, because it is sort of historic, but that's another question. I apologize to keep jumping over all this stuff. I figure whatever you're interested in, you'll stop me at some point or ask me, well, what's the big deal about Freeport, or why is Bloomington one of the top 3 clubs? Freeport had an indoor festival, and they raised $150. Not much, but today that's $3,000. One of the things that we made a lot of effort to, and I had a lot of headaches on this and had fights with copy editors, is we translate something that cost 25 cents in 1867. Well, what does that cost you today? So if you're a footnote freak, you can learn a lot about the 19th century economy from that. So this was an appreciable amount of money for people. That's there's these little glimpses. You're not going to get that by doing a newspaper.com search on the city of Chicago's newspapers. You're not going to find that at all. So that's another reason if you're going to do it, you got to do the whole thing. Here's one of my favorite game accounts. You want to get ahead of it. Try and figure out what was happening on the field. This is a challenge. We don't really have anybody here from Rules and Customs or whatever. We've got Mr. Schumann here. It's not easy. Now, let me digress. Okay, you go to New York, you go to the East Coast, you've got professional sports writers. You've got Henry Chadwick and these other guys, and they've been covering this game for 10 years, and the readership is familiar with the terms. In Illinois, you've got maybe the assistant editor of the newspaper who's never seen baseball before, maybe he's read about it, and he's writing a game story that will appeal to his readers. So, and there's usually not much of a box score if there's a box score. So they're writing about a lot of things besides what's going on the field, and when they talk about what's going on the field, it sometimes is indecipherable. People sort of pop up on base. You don't know how they got there. They disappear. You don't know if they were out or they, fell over, or like the game in Salem when the Central Egyptians played the Salem. What was their name? Greenhorns, I think. The guy from Centralia wanted the team to win so bad. He announced before the game, guys, I want you to win and encourage you to win. I'm going to put a bucket of beer at third base. And so every time you get to third base, you can take a drink. I know Scrappy's writing that down right now.
And we've had clubs tell us, you can't do that, that's not cool. It is historically accurate.
As a historical precedent, I can give you
And
the
we've
footnote.
done it.
I'll give you the footnote, the citation.
See?
And not surprisingly, Centralia won the game, except the player who wrote about this later on said, towards the end of the game, it all gets a little foggy. We don't know. We were just at third base a lot. So you have stuff like that. But this is an account of a game between Bloomington and Peoria in 1866. And start with this batter, a guy from Peoria. Quote, sent the ball into center field but was put out on first base. How? I mean, was he slow? It's Sampson, we know. His name was Stevenson, though, so it wasn't Sampson. He might have been thrown out. But, we would say today a center fielder made a fine throw. Or did he catch it on the fly? Well, usually they say, call on the fly, but they didn't in this case. But here's the sort of stuff you put up. The game was interrupted in the third inning when, quote, a fat Englishman in the crowd persisted in getting in the way, and at this state of the game created a disturbance that was finally quieted. So I want to know, who is this fat Englishman wandering around Bloomington? Forget about the game. Who was this guy? And what kind of a disturbance was he creating? There's a lot. That's a wide area. It could be a lot of things. Well, that wasn't the end of it. In the fourth inning, a Peoria player was put out on second base. Okay, but we don't know how he got to second base. We don't know how he got to first base. All of a sudden, he just pops up in the middle of the story that Bill Jones was put out at second base. Oh, okay, that's nice. A player named Bunn scored, but we don't know how he got on base. So apparently, was that the device in the ancient Greek theater, the machine of the gods that suddenly posited some character down the stage to solve all the problems? And maybe it was the machine of the gods, and he came out of the sky and it was allowed to score. But then we had some more fun in the game. In the fifth inning, quote, a female goose came on the ground and waddled towards shortstop as if to take his place. Now, I've been in some games, especially on my team, where a goose would have been an improvement at shortstop. But apparently she was an uninvited goose. Waddled towards shortstop as if to take his place, but a ball from Stearns was the Peoria player, drove her from the field. So did he just happen to make a hit that hit the goose, or was they say, oh, we're going to take a minute here, I'm going to throw you balls till you chase the goose off the field? We don't know, but we do know the goose was left and Bloomington won the game. Injuries, oh my God, yeah, it's just gross, terrible things happen to people, and they give birth in 19th century style, lots of detail, about the blood and the swelling and the bones and all that. But we only had one. It was one guy downstate was killed, and that wasn't in a, it was in a, I think a pickup game, a young man from Ottawa. And this seems to be the other cases where people were killed. They get hit by a bat or a ball in the lower abdominal area. I asked one of my friends who's a doctor, what the hell's going on? How would something like that kill him? And the answer is probably a hernia, or probably some sort of, intestinal rupture, when they had no way to, there's no x-rays or anything like that, so they'd send you home and say, hope you get better. He was probably, I think, 14 years old. And so anytime a kid was killed playing baseball anywhere in the country, it ran because there was also a feeling that this is a dangerous game and you shouldn't be playing. And we talk about that a lot. I tried my hand at some analysis because, at the end of the day, as Gary was saying, and I don't know how many, tens of thousands of notes, little notes you take. What does it all mean, and what can, more importantly, what can it tell us about the game? And this would probably start a big discussion at a village baseball meeting or a meeting with rules and customs committee. It seems to me that the key to the game was fielding. This is the fly era post 1860. If you had good fielding, you had a pretty good chance of winning. And even in the box scores, they start to notice that. They'll have, fly catches made, fly catches missed. And they'll talk a lot about players who were good fielding. And if we think about it, we're talking about double-digit scores are very, very common. So why? Why? Well, they're not wearing gloves. Okay, we know that. The other thing we know is that unlike everybody in this room, they did not grow up tossing a ball back and forth. They're out, imagine, if we were taken out and said, okay, you've never played soccer in your life. All right, get out here and you're going to play soccer using your feet. Well, that's, what are our feet for? That's maybe kick a football off a tee, that's about it, or a punt. So it was, a lot of it, was breaking in. And so if you had a team that could catch fly balls and could hold on to ground balls, you had a big advantage. When these teams from the Cincinnati Red Sox come in, I'm surprised that Quincy scored 7 runs off of them. I think they must say, oh, let's not make it too bad. Or when Rockford's playing somebody, always a low score. And it can't all be pitching, it's got to be defense. So I think that's a big part of it. So if you had a good fielding team, you had a big advantage. So we can tell that. So I think the high scores primarily are poor fielding. That's why. It was why the scores so high. Pretty clear to me that it was just poor fielding. Because they could all hit. They could all hit. But they couldn't catch. Muffin games, it's great. I'd never heard of muffin until I got to Ohio. And the Ohio muffins are not like these muffins. These guys were, and they love these. And Morris has a whole section. Morris is really sort of the guy who rediscovered these muffin games and gave them their true worth. They loved it. I mean, with no clearer example of the popularity of baseball than muffin games. People would come out to love it. They would write stories in the newspaper days in advance. Making fun of these people. Especially like heavyweight teams versus lightweight teams, and they would have special rules like. They would have wagons to carry the fat guys between bases. A good idea, I think, for miniature baseball. We ought to come to I want one with a nice cushion in it too. We'll see if that happens or not. But doctors versus lawyers. There was or even better, lawyers versus lawyers, and of course the lawyers will get in disputes among themselves, and they have to find a judge to rule whether this was right or not. So a lot of fun. I mean, when it ceases to be fun, that's when it starts to disappear. That isn't, again, disappear is a strong word. That's when the adult clubs go away because it's no longer fun. There's too much, and we talk about. There's a whole chapter in the book about that. All the dark side of paradise or whatever it's called. They have lots of trouble as it becomes more and more competitive. Yeah.
I would just want to get this on film. So you're saying it's historically accurate to have fun and not and just as important as being historically accurate to play a competitive game. They're both important.
Yeah.
So y'all been told, everybody at home, it's okay to have fun and play a game for fun.
And what I would argue is that if you throw out the fun and you overemphasize the competition, you will end up the same way as they ended up in 1869, and they'll be gone. It'll be a game for kids and professionals. Yeah.
Bob, could you argue that the true spirit of competitiveness in baseball really didn't begin until there was that professional team, the Cincinnati Red Stockings, and then moving forward, people realized, well, we could pay to...
Yeah, that's a big part of it, except there were professionals before then. You know, we know that in New York. They were, you know, those rascals, no offense, but they were doing all, because the game, you know, this is the thing, it's stages. It doesn't, you know, something that happens, you know, here in Long Island on January 5th, whatever, doesn't automatically happen here in the middle of Illinois on January 5th. It takes time, it evolves. And so the game that's being played in New York by those top quality teams, and they're good teams because they all tour through the Midwest during this period and play in Illinois, that's a whole different world than with a couple teams here. And there were professional teams in Illinois. What they did was they found jobs. Rockford, you know, this is really an interesting, you know, thing. I didn't get into it too much, but you know, they just had a lot of talent there, and then to keep that talent, they said, okay, we'll find you a job. The team that everybody hated, the Chicago Excelsiors, they were probably the best team and the most hated team, even in Chicago. I don't know what everybody, they must have had bad breath or something. I don't know. Nobody liked them. But they, to the outrage of everybody, they came down state. You probably know the famous defeat of the Excelsiors by the Washington Nationals, another essentially professional team. They all had government jobs in the U.S. Treasury Department. But that, you know, and they just clobbered the Excelsiors. But what made it even worse was the game before, the Washington Nationals, who had been undefeated, they cut through the Midwest like one of those big scythes that cuts down, you know, or skiffs or whatever, that cuts down hay, just clobbered everybody. Here's this little team from Rockford, the Forest Cities, with this teenage pitcher, Spalding, who this is sort of a rest game before they play the Excelsiors, and they lose. The Nationals are beaten by Albert Spalding and the Forest Cities 27-24, and Chadwick is there. That's what makes it a big deal. All this is like, it'd be imagined if like the awkward club from Florida defeats the Stingrays, Tampa Bay Rays, you know, next week or something. It would be like, wow, you know, how could it happen? And then everybody, well, then that means the Chicago team is going to clobber the Nationals can be beat by that. No, the Nationals took it out on the Excelsior, so even people in Chicago were mad at them. They came in downstate. Said, okay, we got to find the best players, and so they got Spalding off the Rockford team, and they came to Bloomington to get one of my favorite players. I always like these tragic figures. Patrick J. Keenan, an Irish immigrant who was considered a pretty good pitcher, and actually defeats Spalding in a Chicago Excelsior inter squad game. Who's heard of Patrick Keenan? Nobody. It's me. It was a complete discovery, a new discovery, and all the papers in downstate went crazy. You know, how dare they do this? Well, they did it because they wanted to win, and they got both these guys nice jobs that were paying them a lot of money to leave work at 3 o'clock every day and go practice baseball. So it was coming on. And they also have a reaction. Well, baseball is going to be professional. We don't want anything to do with it. And so, Bill, to get back to your original question, that's about time Cincinnati comes along. It's pretty clear that if you want, if you're going to have a winning baseball team, you're going to have to pay. You're going to have to pay for the players. And if you're not going to have a winning team because of some other pressures, we can talk about those other pressures if you're interested. Why bother? Why not just get together on a Sunday picnic or have a pickup game, and we'll go on from that. My favorite chapter I had to fight for, which at the end is epilogue, it's called Ghosts, and I was able to even trace some of these guys on down into the end. And you might be interested to know that among Illinois baseball players, one invented the fly swatter. So the next time you swat a fly, say, there's Decatur again, whack, you'll feel really good. Decatur, Illinois gave us the fly swatter. Another became, I think, at the time he was the first. I think maybe since then there's been at least one other, maybe two. The only man elected to the U.S. Senate as a Republican and then later as a Democrat. And he was a player from Springfield. Well, it's a I can explain the story. It has nothing to do with 21st century. It's all late 19th century politics, and it makes sense if you know. But he was the son of a big Republican in Illinois, a buddy of Abraham Lincoln's, which is also connected to the railway Springfield Capital thing, which is another story. Samuel Montgomery invented the fly. One of my favorite guys is G.W. Blake from Ottawa. What a life he had, and again, politics. He I won't go on with it, but anyway, he died on the stump, and he was giving a political speech, and he said, "What time is it? How much time do I have left?" And you're probably wishing the same thing right now. And they said, "Yeah, it's, whatever, 11:15." And he started speaking and dropped dead right there in front of the whole crowd. But it being Illinois, he won the election. I'll let that one sink in. Those who aren't from Illinois. I ought to know I voted for him, and it was in 1901. And Patrick J. Keenan, who's a real, like a lot, some of this life is full of tragedy, and this is a guy who, once his pitching skills left, he sort of became an alcoholic. And so his mention in the news is things like him being arrested, running a gambling game in the basement of a tavern in Bloomington, or on a tear in downtown Bloomington and falling through a plate glass window. And he's buried in the same cemetery as old Hoss Rodberg. Yes.
And Don's parents.
Are they buried in?
They're right next to one another.
I can
Oh,
see.
that's Chadwick. Oh.
That's Chadwick.
Yeah. Keenan and what's his name? Yeah.
I'm back at Chad.
Well, they're all good guys. So yeah. Even Radbourne, who's he's a character. If you haven't read the books on Radbourne by Eric, what's his name? Ed Acorn. He won 54 games in 18 years. The record is never going to be broken. He's also the first man on record to, I won't show you, but it's imagine raising your middle finger. In a team picture, he has his middle finger sticking out. So you can sort of get
Did they know that
feel.
downstairs?
Yeah, it could have been one of the Andersons. No, it would have been a Prius. A Prius would have done
Look at
that.
family pictures more closely.
Can I get the year on when the first middle finger was raised in a game? What was the year on that?
Well, it was in the team picture.
Oh, it was the
It's
team
like the
picture.
1880s. I think it's his
1880.
picture with Providence.
Okay.
I think it was 1884, was it? So I've rattled on long enough.
You
So
can't carve the day middle fingers.
What's the author's name who writes books about old Hoss Radbourne?
Ed Acorn. He's got two great books on baseball. It's like 54 and 84 or something like
that's
that.
it.
And then he has the Beer and Whiskey League about the old American Association. So you can't go wrong. He's now turned to writing about Lincoln. So he's really popular and probably getting rich as we speak.
Can I ask you a question about Lincoln?
Sure.
Even though I don't know if this is in your book.
He couldn't feel with the damn.
He couldn't
Couldn't
just
hit
want to
either.
hit all the time.
He wanted to hit all the time and struck out.
Was there, this is probably folklore, but heard it said that, Lincoln was playing baseball when he heard he got the
Yeah.
1856 Republican convention.
Yeah.
That's not true.
He was playing what we might think as a version of handball in an alley.
Yeah.
And it's actually right next to the Lincoln Museum and Presidential Library there in downtown Springfield. But yeah, But there's a famous cartoon
Oh.
of him and Douglas and Breckenridge and
Oh.
who was the
And a
other guy,
skunk.
John Bell.
And a skunk.
Oh, that's a fabulous.
Pardon?
And a skunk. There was a
Yeah, a
skunk in the
skunk.
cartoon,
Yeah,
too.
a skunk.
Oh,
They have the bats in their hand. Yeah. So.
We had Lincoln hit for us in Keokuk.
That's right.
Oh, any other? I'm sorry, I didn't even talk that long.
Tell us where to get the book and that bit. Tell us.
Oh,
Just
this?
do the book promotion.
You can get it today, but you go to the U of I Press, and you can get it for half price. This is the last day. They figured my talk would kill the sales of it, so they wanted to get it in quick. And they're going to ask you for a discount code, and the discount code is OAH23. OAH23, because they're having another big history conference because they put all their books on sale. It's just not for them. So if you see other books you want there, they have some good baseball books too. Anything else? Well, thank you for coming. I appreciate it.